When God is silent, something serious is happening. If God has been silent lately, this is not a small thing. Silence is not neutral, and it is never random. When your prayers feel unanswered, when anxiety grows instead of peace, when fear shows up even though you still believe, something deeper is happening inside you. You keep praying, you keep trusting, but the clarity is gone. The Holy Spirit feels quiet. Jesus feels distant. And that silence starts to feel heavier than the problem itself. You don't talk about it, but it overwhelms you, because silence leaves you alone with your thoughts. But what if this silence is not absence? What if God is not ignoring you, but changing the way He works in you? Stay here, because what this silence means may explain more about your faith, your anxiety, and your future than any answer you've been waiting for. The moment silence becomes noticeable, silence does not arrive as a clear event. It does not knock, warn, or explain itself. It slips in quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize that something essential has changed. You are still praying. You still believe in God. You still speak the name of Jesus with sincerity. But the familiar sense of response is gone. The peace that used to come quickly now delays. The clarity that once felt natural now feels distant. And that is when silence becomes noticeable. Not because God changed suddenly, but because you did. This moment is deeply unsettling because it exposes something most people never admit. Faith often feels strongest when it is answered. When prayers bring relief, when the Holy Spirit feels near, when fear is replaced by peace, belief feels stable. But when silence enters, faith is no longer supported by emotional feedback. It has to stand on trust alone. And that transition creates anxiety, not because faith is weak, but because it is being stripped of its comforts. Many people misunderstand this stage. They assume silence means abandonment, punishment, or divine disappointment. But silence rarely appears at the beginning of faith. It usually comes after consistency, after commitment, after a relationship has already been established. God does not go silent to push people away. He becomes quiet when faith is ready to move from dependence to depth. Silence is not the absence of care. It is the withdrawal of explanation. When silence becomes noticeable, it often reveals how much reassurance mattered more than relationship. How often peace came from feeling guided instead of choosing trust. This realization can feel uncomfortable, even threatening, because it forces an honest question. Do I trust God only when I understand Him, or do I trust Him even when I don't? Silence brings that question to the surface, and it does not allow easy answers. This is why the first reaction to silence is usually restlessness. The mind searches for substitutes, advice, signs, interpretations, quick decisions, anything to replace the discomfort of not knowing. Silence feels dangerous because it removes control. It leaves space, and space exposes fear, insecurity, and unresolved expectations we did not know were there. What once felt like peace now feels like vulnerability. Yet this moment is not accidental. Silence becomes noticeable when God is no longer shaping behavior, but identity. When faith is no longer about response, but about posture. God does not explain Himself in this phase because explanation would keep faith external. Silence invites faith to move inward. It forces belief to mature, not by information, but by endurance. There is a reason this stage feels heavy. Silence removes spiritual noise and reveals what remains underneath. Motives, attachments, emotional dependencies, expectations placed on God that were never spoken out loud. When those things surface, silence feels unbearable. But that discomfort is not meant to destroy faith. It is meant to refine it. Those who leave at this stage often say God stopped speaking. In reality, God stopped speaking the way they expected. Silence changes the relationship. It removes the constant reassurance so that trust can become intentional, not reactive. This is the moment where faith either collapses under the need for answers or deepens through the decision to remain. Silence does not mean nothing is happening. It means something irreversible is forming. If you can stay present without forcing clarity, if you can resist the urge to escape the quiet, you begin to realize that silence is not empty. It is purposeful. And what it is shaping in you cannot be built in noise. Why silence feels more threatening than loss. Loss hurts, but silence unsettles. Loss at least gives shape to pain. You know what was taken. You know what changed. Silence offers none of that clarity. It leaves you suspended, unable to grieve fully, unable to move forward, unable to name what is wrong. When God is silent, the problem is not only spiritual, it becomes psychological, emotional, and deeply human. Silence feels threatening because it removes orientation. When something is taken away, you can adjust. When a door closes, you can grieve and eventually redirect. But when nothing happens, when prayers remain unanswered and guidance does not arrive, the mind fills the gap with fear. Anxiety grows not from what is happening, but from what might be happening. Silence gives imagination too much space, and imagination without grounding often turns against you. This is why silence often feels heavier than rejection. A clear no still feels like communication. Silence feels like being left alone with your thoughts. And the thoughts that surface in silence are rarely gentle. They question your worth, your faith, your understanding of God. They whisper that maybe you were wrong to trust so deeply, to hope so openly, to believe that peace would come if you stayed faithful. In Christian spirituality, silence has always been one of the most difficult experiences of faith. Not because God is absent, but because silence removes the sense of relational feedback. We are wired for response. From childhood, connection is reinforced through reaction. Silence feels like disconnection, even when it is not. And that instinctive fear does not disappear just because you believe in God. Silence also threatens the illusion of control. When God speaks, even gently, you feel oriented. You know where you stand. You know what to do next. Silence removes that structure. It places you in a space where obedience is no longer guided step by step, but sustained by trust. That shift feels unsafe, especially for those who learned faith through certainty rather than surrender. Another reason silence feels so dangerous is because it exposes emotional dependency. Many people do not realize how much their peace depended on feeling God close, rather than trusting His presence. Silence interrupts that pattern. It forces a painful realization. Faith was not only about relationship, it was also about reassurance. And when reassurance disappears, insecurity rushes in. This is where many people confuse spiritual silence with personal failure. They assume something must be wrong with them, that God withdrew because they disappointed Him. But silence does not operate on merit, it operates on timing. God does not go quiet because you failed. He goes quiet because something in you needs to stand without constant affirmation. Silence feels threatening because it removes emotional cushioning. It strips faith of immediate reward. You pray, but peace does not arrive on schedule. You trust, but clarity does not follow. And in that gap, fear grows louder. Not because God is distant, but because internal noise finally has room to speak. Yet this discomfort reveals something important. Silence shows where faith was still transactional, where belief was unconsciously tied to outcome, where trust depended on response. When those supports are removed, faith is no longer automatic. It becomes a decision made in uncertainty. And that decision is the threshold of spiritual maturity. Loss ends something. Silence prepares something. That is why it feels more threatening. Loss allows closure. Silence demands patience. Loss allows tears. Silence demands endurance. And endurance reshapes the soul in ways comfort never could. If you can understand this, silence begins to lose its power to frighten. Not because it becomes pleasant, but because it becomes meaningful. Silence is not trying to harm you. It is confronting the parts of faith that cannot survive without constant reassurance. And what remains after that confrontation is quieter, deeper, and far more resilient. When God stops explaining himself. There is a moment in faith that feels almost unsettling in its simplicity. God no longer explains himself. No clarification, no justification, no clear reason attached to what you are experiencing. You pray, but the answers no longer arrive with meaning attached. You read scripture, but nothing seems to point directly to your situation. And slowly, you realize that God has stopped translating himself into terms that make you comfortable. This is not neglect, it is a shift. Early in faith, explanations are common. God teaches, confirms, reassures. He meets insecurity with clarity because clarity is needed at the beginning. But there comes a time when explanation would keep faith immature, when constant understanding would prevent trust from forming its own roots. So God becomes quiet, not because he has nothing to say, but because saying it would weaken what needs to grow. When God stops explaining himself, faith stops being informational and becomes relational. You are no longer asked to understand before you trust. You are asked to trust without understanding. And this is where many people struggle, because modern spirituality often trains believers to expect answers as proof of closeness. Silence disrupts that expectation. It removes the illusion that faith exists to satisfy curiosity. This phase often triggers frustration. You want reasons, you want timelines. You want to know why the anxiety remains, why peace feels delayed, why clarity has not arrived. But explanation would keep you focused on outcome instead of formation. God's silence here is not a lack of care, it is restraint. He refuses to give answers that would keep you dependent on explanation instead of developing discernment. In Christian spirituality, this moment is sacred but uncomfortable. It is where faith moves from learning about God to learning how to walk with him. Explanations educate the mind, silence shapes the soul, and the soul cannot be shaped by information alone. It needs space, tension, and unresolved trust to mature. When God stops explaining himself, you may feel exposed. You realize how often you relied on clarity to feel safe, how often peace depended on understanding rather than surrender. Silence reveals those attachments gently but firmly. It shows where faith was still negotiating terms, where belief expected transparency instead of trust. This is also where faith becomes personal rather than inherited. Explanations can be borrowed. Silence cannot. You cannot lean on someone else's interpretation in this phase. You must decide what kind of relationship you want with God when answers are no longer provided. Do you stay only when things make sense, or do you remain even when they do not? God's silence here is not meant to confuse you. It is meant to strengthen internal alignment. When explanations stop, discernment begins to develop. You start learning how to listen without words, how to remain steady without reassurance, how to trust presence instead of response. This kind of faith does not feel dramatic. It feels quiet, grounded, and resilient. Those who endure this phase often discover something unexpected. When God stops explaining himself, faith becomes less anxious. Not immediately, but gradually. You stop demanding certainty. You stop forcing meaning. You begin to live without needing constant confirmation. And in that space, peace returns in a deeper form, not as relief, but as stability. Silence is not God withdrawing truth. It is God trusting you with depth. Explanations are training wheels. Silence is the open road. And the decision to keep walking without constant guidance is what transforms belief into something unshakable. The hidden transition from dependence to responsibility. There is a quiet shift that happens in faith, and most people do not recognize it while it is taking place. It is the moment when God begins to treat you less like someone who needs constant direction, and more like someone who is capable of carrying responsibility. This transition is subtle, and it often feels like loss before it feels like growth. Guidance becomes less explicit, direction becomes less detailed, and the silence that follows can feel unsettling if you are not prepared for what it means. Dependence is natural in the early stages of faith. You learn by being led. You grow by receiving instruction. God reassures, corrects, and intervenes clearly because your internal framework is still forming. But there comes a time when continued dependence would limit growth, when being told what to do would prevent you from becoming someone who can choose wisely on your own. Silence appears precisely at that threshold. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They assume God has stepped back because they failed, when in reality He has stepped back because they are capable. Responsibility is not abandonment, it is trust. God does not remove guidance to confuse you. He removes it to activate discernment. He allows silence so that you can begin to act from internal alignment rather than external instruction. This transition often exposes fear. When responsibility increases, the safety of constant confirmation disappears. You are no longer guided step by step. You must decide, reflect, and move forward without knowing every outcome. This can trigger anxiety, especially for those who learn to associate faith with certainty. Silence feels dangerous because it removes the buffer between decision and consequence. Yet this is where faith becomes real. Responsibility forces faith to move from reaction to intention. You are no longer responding to direction. You are embodying it. The values that were once reinforced externally now need to live inside you. Silence tests whether faith has become part of your identity or whether it still relies on instruction to function. Christian spirituality has always understood this stage as necessary. God does not want followers who only obey when directed. He wants people who can carry His values into situations where no clear instruction exists. Silence prepares you for complexity. It trains you to discern, not just comply, to act wisely, not just obediently. This transition also reveals how much comfort came from being led. Dependence feels safe because it removes responsibility for outcomes. When God speaks clearly, you feel protected from making mistakes. Silence removes that protection. You are now responsible for how you respond, how you choose, and how you trust. That weight can feel overwhelming at first, but it is also where growth accelerates. Many people resist this stage by seeking replacement voices, leaders, opinions, signs, interpretations, anything that restores the feeling of being told what to do. But those substitutes often keep faith shallow. God's silence is intentional. It creates space for maturity to develop without interference. It forces you to sit with uncertainty long enough for wisdom to emerge. Responsibility in faith does not mean independence from God. It means alignment with Him. You are not left alone. You are being trusted. Silence is not God stepping away. It is God stepping back so that what He has already placed within you can begin to operate. Discernment cannot grow if it is constantly overridden by instruction. This stage reshapes prayer as well. Prayer becomes less about asking for direction and more about staying aligned, less about answers and more about presence. You begin to realize that God is not trying to control every step. He is forming someone who can walk steadily even when the path is unclear. The hidden transition from dependence to responsibility is uncomfortable because it demands ownership. You can no longer outsource trust. You can no longer wait passively for clarity. You must engage faith actively, even in silence. And when you do, something shifts. Faith stops being fragile. It becomes grounded, intentional, and resilient. Silence marks this transition not to test you, but to empower you. Responsibility is the evidence that God believes you are ready. And if you remain present through this phase, you will discover that silence was not the end of guidance. It was the beginning of wisdom. Silence as a boundary, not a distance. Silence often feels like separation. When God does not respond the way you expect, the instinctive conclusion is that distance has grown, that something has shifted relationally. But silence is not always about how far God is. Many times it is about how close you are to a threshold you are not meant to cross yet. Silence in these moments is not absence. It is a boundary. Boundaries exist to protect, not to punish. In human relationships, boundaries preserve what cannot survive constant access. In spiritual life, boundaries protect timing, growth, and internal readiness. God's silence often functions the same way. It limits movement not because you are unworthy, but because moving too quickly would cost you something you are not aware of yet. This is difficult to accept because silence does not feel protective. It feels withholding. It feels like something is being kept from you. And in a sense, it is. Not because God wants to deprive you, but because premature clarity can harm what is still forming. Some answers carry weight. Some directions demand strength you may not have yet. Silence delays exposure until alignment is strong enough to hold what is coming. Silence as a boundary also interrupts impulse. When guidance is immediate, action often follows emotion. Silence slows that process. It forces reflection. It creates space between desire and decision. That space is not empty. It is where wisdom has time to surface. God does not always block paths with obstacles. Sometimes He blocks them with quiet. This is why silence often appears when you are emotionally invested in an outcome. When longing is strong, judgment can blur. Silence creates restraint. It prevents faith from becoming driven by urgency instead of discernment. The lack of response is not God ignoring you. It is God refusing to accelerate something that would later cause damage. In Christian spirituality, boundaries are signs of care. God does not open every door just because it is requested. Silence guards against choices that feel right emotionally, but are misaligned spiritually. It protects you from mistaking desire for direction. Silence holds you in place long enough for motivation to be purified. Many people misread this boundary and push against it. They interpret silence as resistance and respond with pressure. More prayer, more urgency, more demand. But boundaries are not removed by force. They are lifted by readiness. God does not respond to insistence. He responds to alignment. Silence also protects identity. When clarity arrives too soon, identity often forms around outcome instead of character. Silence delays reward so that formation can happen first. God is not interested in giving answers that would reinforce insecurity or ego. Silence guards the inner life while the outer situation remains unresolved. This boundary can feel frustrating because it limits movement when you want relief. But relief without growth often leads back to the same place. Silence prevents repetition. It holds you still long enough for patterns to break. It interrupts cycles that would continue if answers came too easily. Understanding silence as a boundary changes how you experience it. Instead of assuming distance, you begin to ask what is being protected, what is being preserved, what is being prevented. Silence invites trust, not in God's response, but in His restraint. Boundaries require patience. They demand respect even when they are not explained. God does not always tell you why the boundary exists. He asks you to trust that it does. Silence is His way of saying not yet without closing the relationship. If you can remain within this boundary without resentment, something shifts. The silence stops feeling hostile. It begins to feel intentional. You realize that God has not stepped away. He has drawn a line around something sacred, and He is waiting, not for your persistence, but for your readiness. Silence is not distance, it is containment. And what is being contained is not punishment, it is potential. The inner noise that silence exposes. Silence does not create chaos, it reveals it. When God grows quiet, the external noise fades, and what remains is whatever has been living underneath all along. Thoughts you did not want to face, fears you managed to outrun, expectations you never named. Silence removes distraction, and in that stillness, the inner noise becomes impossible to ignore. This is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of divine silence. When guidance is clear, attention stays outward. You focus on direction, instruction, next steps. But when God is silent, attention turns inward. And what many people discover there is not peace, but unrest. Anxiety rises, questions multiply. Old insecurities resurface. Silence becomes heavy because it amplifies what was previously masked by reassurance. The mind does not like unresolved space. It rushes to fill it. In silence, thoughts become louder. Fear becomes persuasive. Doubt feels logical. This does not mean faith is failing. It means silence has removed the buffers that once kept inner conflict at bay. God's silence does not introduce anxiety. It exposes where anxiety already existed. Many people assume peace should automatically follow faith. But peace is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to remain steady in its presence. Silence reveals whether peace was rooted in trust or in constant reassurance. When reassurance disappears, what remains is what faith was truly resting on. This exposure can feel overwhelming. You begin to question things you thought were settled, not because belief is gone, but because silence no longer distracts you from unresolved issues. Emotional wounds, unmet expectations, and hidden pressures surface. Silence forces honesty. It does not allow you to bypass internal work with external spirituality. Christian spirituality understands this process deeply. Silence is not meant to comfort at first. It is meant to confront. God often becomes quiet when the soul needs attention more than instruction. When internal alignment matters more than external direction. Silence brings you face to face with yourself, and that encounter is rarely gentle. This is where many people try to escape. They seek noise, activity, explanation, anything to quiet the inner unrest. But noise only postpones what silence is trying to reveal. God's silence is not asking you to fix everything. It is asking you to notice what you have been avoiding. The inner noise exposed by silence is not your enemy. It is information. It shows where trust is fragile, where fear has influence, where peace was conditional. Silence uncovers these areas not to shame you, but to strengthen you. What is exposed can be addressed. What remains hidden continues to control you. This phase often feels lonely because no one else can sit inside your thoughts with you. Silence is personal. It isolates in order to individualize growth. You cannot rely on borrowed faith here. You must confront your own inner landscape honestly. That confrontation is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. As you remain in silence, something begins to shift. The inner noise loses some of its power, not because answers arrive, but because awareness grows. You stop reacting to every thought. You begin to observe them. Anxiety stops dictating meaning. Fear stops controlling direction. Silence teaches discernment not through explanation, but through exposure. Eventually, silence no longer feels as threatening, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer afraid of what it reveals. You realize that God did not grow quiet to abandon you. He grew quiet to show you where healing, maturity, and stability needed to begin. Silence exposes inner noise so that peace can become real, not emotional. And once peace is grounded internally, it no longer depends on answers to survive. Why silence often precedes redirection. Silence often arrives right before something changes, but not the kind of change you are expecting. Most people look for redirection in the form of new clarity, new doors, or new motivation. God often chooses the opposite. He removes clarity first. He allows motivation to fade. He lets familiar direction lose its pull. And only then does redirection begin. This is because true redirection cannot happen while attachment remains strong. As long as you are emotionally invested in a specific outcome, path, or identity, any new direction will be filtered through old expectations. Silence loosens those attachments. It slowly disconnects desire from certainty. What once felt urgent starts to feel heavy. What once felt right begins to feel incomplete. This discomfort is not confusion. It is detachment in progress. God rarely redirects by force. He redirects by diminishing the hold of what is no longer aligned. Silence weakens emotional dependency on paths that have already served their purpose. It creates internal distance before external change. When God goes quiet, it is often because He is allowing something to lose influence over you without confrontation. This is why silence feels disorienting. You no longer feel pulled forward, but you are not pushed away either. You are suspended between what was and what is coming. That space feels uncomfortable because identity has not caught up with direction yet. Silence holds you there long enough for old motivations to dissolve. Many people misinterpret this phase and panic. They assume they are stuck, when in reality they are being repositioned. They try to revive old passion through effort, prayer, or pressure. But God does not restore what He is preparing to replace. Silence is His way of letting something end naturally, without conflict. Redirection requires internal readiness. If clarity arrived too soon, you would carry old attachments into a new season. Silence prevents that. It creates emotional neutrality. It quiets the internal noise that would distort new direction. Only when desire is no longer controlling decision can redirection be trusted. Christian spirituality shows that God often redirects people after a season of quiet, not when they are emotionally strong, but when they are emotionally surrendered. Silence brings you to a place where you stop demanding movement and start accepting alignment. That shift is subtle, but it is critical. Silence also tests motivation. It reveals whether you are following God for purpose or for comfort. When comfort disappears, only genuine alignment remains. Redirection built on comfort collapses quickly. Redirection built on alignment endures pressure, uncertainty, and delay. This is why silence often precedes change. It strips away urgency. It removes emotional pressure. It allows wisdom to surface without competition. God does not redirect impulsive hearts. He redirects settled ones. Silence creates that settlement internally before anything changes externally. At some point, without effort, you notice a shift. Old paths no longer attract you the same way. Old goals feel incomplete. You are not pulled backward, but you are no longer rushing forward either. That neutrality is not stagnation. It is readiness. Redirection is already happening beneath the surface. When clarity finally returns, it feels different. It is quieter, less emotional, more stable. It does not excite you, it steadies you. That is how you know redirection came from God, not impulse. Silence prepared you to recognize it. Silence does not delay redirection, it enables it. And if you remain patient in this phase, you will realize that God was not withholding direction. He was removing everything that would have distorted it. You eat the spiritual cost of forcing answers. When silence becomes uncomfortable, the instinct to force clarity grows strong. The waiting feels unbearable. The uncertainty feels unsafe. And slowly, pressure replaces patience. You begin to look for answers everywhere, not because God is leading you there, but because silence feels like a threat that must be neutralized. This is where the spiritual cost begins to accumulate. Forcing answers rarely looks dramatic. It often looks reasonable. You seek advice that confirms what you already want. You interpret emotions as signs. You mistake urgency for direction. You tell yourself that movement is better than waiting, that doing something is better than sitting in silence. But movement without alignment creates distance, not progress. The cost of forcing answers is subtle but deep. You begin to rely on substitutes for discernment. External voices become louder than inner alignment. Anxiety starts making decisions disguised as wisdom. Faith becomes reactive instead of grounded. What you call clarity is often just relief from discomfort, not guidance from God. Christian spirituality teaches that God does not compete with noise. When answers are forced, they rarely come from a place of peace. They come from fear of waiting, fear of missing out, fear of being left behind. Silence exposes these fears so they can be addressed. Forcing answers covers them up and allows them to lead. One of the greatest dangers of forcing answers is that it trains the soul to distrust waiting. You begin to associate silence with failure instead of formation. Over time, faith becomes dependent on constant stimulation. When God does not respond quickly, impatience fills the gap. That impatience does not bring peace, it brings fragmentation. Forcing answers also reshapes prayer. Prayer becomes a demand instead of a connection. You pray not to align, but to control outcome. The focus shifts from relationship to resolution. When resolution does not come, frustration grows. God feels distant, not because he moved, but because expectation replaced openness. Another cost is spiritual confusion. When answers are rushed, they are often inconsistent. One day you feel sure, the next day you doubt. Anxiety rises because forced clarity cannot sustain confidence. True direction brings steadiness. Forced answers require constant reinforcement. Silence was meant to build stability. Forcing answers builds dependence on reassurance. There is also the cost of premature commitment. Decisions made in silence, driven by discomfort, often lock you into paths that do not align with who you are becoming. God's silence was protecting you from those commitments. Forcing answers overrides that protection. It trades long-term formation for short-term relief. Many people look back and realize the moments they regret most were not caused by silence, but by the choices they made trying to escape it. Silence was not the enemy. The refusal to remain was. God did not withhold guidance. He withheld it long enough for wisdom to develop. Forcing answers interrupted that process. Silence requires humility. It asks you to admit that you do not control timing. Forcing answers is often an attempt to regain control. It is understandable, but costly. Faith matures when it learns to remain steady without resolution. That steadiness cannot be rushed. When you stop forcing answers, something changes. The pressure eases. The need to decide fades. You begin to notice alignment returning quietly, not as excitement, but as calm certainty. Silence begins to feel less hostile because you are no longer fighting it. God does not reward impatience with clarity. He responds to readiness with direction. Silence is not something to defeat. It is something to endure with awareness. When you resist the urge to force answers, you protect your faith from distortion. The spiritual cost of forcing answers is not punishment. It is misalignment. And misalignment always feels like confusion, anxiety, and exhaustion. Silence was trying to spare you from that cost. Staying with it allows faith to remain whole. Type 1 to write the next topic, or type the changes you want. 1.9. Learning to stay without understanding. There is a kind of faith that only exists when understanding is removed. It is not dramatic. It is not emotional. It does not feel powerful in the moment. It feels quiet, restrained, and unresolved. Learning to stay in that place without demanding clarity is one of the most difficult and transformative experiences in Christian spirituality. Staying without understanding goes against instinct. The mind wants resolution. The heart wants reassurance. Silence feels incomplete, and incompleteness creates tension. But faith that requires explanation is fragile. It depends on information to survive. When God withholds explanation, He is not testing intelligence. He is shaping trust. This is the stage where faith stops asking why and starts asking how to remain. Not how to fix the situation, but how to stay grounded inside it. You are no longer trying to solve silence. You are learning to live inside it without losing yourself. That shift changes everything. Staying without understanding does not mean becoming passive. It means becoming present. You stop projecting fear into the future. You stop replaying the past looking for mistakes. You remain where you are, aware of uncertainty, without letting it control your actions. This kind of staying requires strength that certainty never demands. Christian faith has always valued this posture, even though it is rarely celebrated. Scripture speaks often of waiting, enduring, remaining. Not waiting with excitement, but waiting with resolve. Not enduring with clarity, but enduring with trust. Silence creates the conditions where this kind of faith can grow. This phase often feels lonely because it cannot be shared easily. People want answers. They want progress. They want testimony. Silence offers none of that. You have nothing to explain except that you are still here, still believing, still trusting without proof. That quiet perseverance forms a faith that does not depend on outcome. Learning to stay without understanding also dismantles fear slowly. Fear thrives on imagined conclusions. When you stop feeding those conclusions, fear loses influence. You realize that not knowing has not destroyed you. Waiting has not erased your faith. Silence has not undone your relationship with God. That realization builds confidence quietly. Over time, something unexpected happens. Peace begins to return, not because answers arrive, but because resistance fades. You stop fighting the silence. You stop demanding resolution. You accept that understanding is not always the foundation of trust. Presence is. This kind of faith is resilient. It does not collapse when prayers feel unanswered. It does not panic when clarity is delayed. It remains steady because it is rooted in relationship, not response. Silence no longer feels like a threat. It becomes a space where faith rests without pressure. Staying without understanding prepares you for whatever comes next. When direction eventually returns, you receive it without desperation. When change arrives, you are not driven by urgency. You move with stability because faith has learned to exist without explanation. God is not asking you to understand everything. He is asking you to remain when understanding is unavailable. That staying is not weakness. It is spiritual strength forming quietly. If God is silent, you are not forgotten. Silence has a way of convincing you that you have been overlooked, that if God truly cared, He would speak, that if your prayers mattered, there would be some response by now. This is the most dangerous lie silence tries to plant. Not that God is distant, but that you are insignificant. And that lie only takes root when silence is misunderstood. God does not forget those He is forming. Silence is not the behavior of indifference. It is the posture of intention. The quiet you are experiencing is not random. It is not neglect. It is not abandonment. It is the space where faith is no longer being carried by emotion, explanation, or reassurance, but by relationship itself. If God were absent, silence would feel empty. But what you are experiencing feels heavy, meaningful, pressing. That weight is not absence. It is involvement. Silence carries weight because something is happening beneath the surface. Growth that cannot be rushed. Alignment that cannot be explained. Strength that cannot be borrowed. Christian spirituality teaches that God is closest when He seems most quiet. Not because He withdraws, but because He is working in ways that words would interrupt. Silence does not mean God has turned away. It means He is shaping something too deep to be explained while it is happening. You are not forgotten because forgetting produces detachment. Silence produces formation. Forgetting leads to drift. Silence leads to grounding. What you are experiencing is not loss of relationship. It is deepening of it. God is not asking you to feel close. He is teaching you to remain close without feeling anything at all. One day, clarity will return. Direction will come back. Peace will settle again. But when it does, you will notice something different. You will not need it the way you used to. You will not depend on it to stand. Silence has done its work by then. Faith will feel quieter, but stronger. Less emotional, but more stable. Until that day, remember this. Silence is not a message of rejection. It is evidence of trust. God trusts what He is building in you enough to let it grow without constant reinforcement. He is not distant. He is deliberate. If God is silent, something serious is happening. And that something is not your loss. It is your formation.